Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel. We all know that the past couple of years have been pretty difficult when it comes to different shortages and inflation. While it's been a while since everything has been out of stock all at once, there have been shortages of different things at different times. But even though we may be able to find something on the shelf, paying for it is a whole other problem. We've seen food prices creep up steadily and sometimes spike within a very short amount of time. And with all the economic uncertainty that we've been experiencing recently, it isn't unreasonable to be concerned that these issues may only get worse. When you throw various global tensions into the mix, it makes sense for us to try to have as much control over our food supply as possible. And storing food is the most basic way to do this. Picking up things like canned goods, dried beans, and rice, along with other staples, is an absolute must, and you should have as much of these as your finances and space allow. However, if a situation lasts long enough, your food storage could eventually run out, even if it's fairly substantial. Hunting, fishing, and trapping may be an option for some, but it's important to understand that in a more severe long-term situation, game animals could be hunted to the point of extinction. Also, there could be situations where fishing may not be safe due to pollution or other circumstances. And being able to produce your own food can insulate you from many of these outside circumstances. This can include things like raising different kinds of animals, but that can be a challenge for some people. Those who live in an apartment probably won't be able to do this at all, while those who live in a house but don't have a large piece of property would be limited to smaller things like rabbits and chickens. But something nearly all of us can do is gardening. Of course, you'll get the most benefit from it if you have a large piece of property, but even those who live in very small dwellings have at least some options. And the first thing that you need to do is determine the kind of garden that you're going to have. And this is going to depend largely on the space that you have to work with, and then also the work that you're willing to put into it. While apartment dwellers have less options, even those who live in something like a small studio apartment can grow sprouts. Pretty much all you need is a glass jar, some seeds, and a sunny windowsill. The next level up is container gardening, and this is a good option for both apartment dwellers and those who have a house with a small yard. Many common vegetable plants like tomatoes and peppers can do very well growing in containers, and the varieties that produce smaller fruit like chili peppers or cherry tomatoes do especially well. Containers can be nice planter pots, buckets, or grow bags. However, I wouldn't recommend using anything less than a 5-gallon bucket. A container that size or larger is going to give your plant's roots plenty of room to grow, and they're not going to dry out as quickly in the heat as a smaller container would. To prepare your bucket, start by drilling some holes in the bottom. This will allow them to drain properly. Then add some rocks or something heavy to the bottom to prevent them from blowing over in the wind. Adding a layer of mulch on top of the rocks will also help with drainage. From there, you can add soil and then your plant. If you want to make your container garden look a little nicer, then you can put your plants in something like this container garden stand that I built last year. But you probably want to put down some sort of weed barrier material because weeds can grow in between those buckets and they're a little bit difficult to deal with. And I'm probably also going to add some gravel in between my buckets this year as well. One downside to container gardening though is that it can be time consuming to water. Raised garden beds are another good option if you at least have a small yard, and this is something that I'm going to start doing this year. And raised beds are a very good choice if you're like me and you have a yard that maybe doesn't have the best soil. They also tend to have less weeds and can help with both water retention and drainage. Beds can also be very cheap and easy to make. For this one, I just picked up 3 2x10x8s, chopped one of them in half, and then bolted the pieces to the ends of the other boards. The lumber cost around $25 total, and the whole project only took a few minutes. As for the soil that I'll be putting into them, I'll be doing a mix of some newly purchased garden soil along with some potting mix that I used last year. To reuse potting mix, remove it from its container and then place it in something like a black garbage bag and tie it shut. And the reason why I'm using a shovel to do this is to avoid getting a lot of mulch and rocks from the bottom of the bucket into the bag. Keep it in a sunny place for several weeks, and the sun should sanitize the soil of anything that could harm this year's garden. I was initially doing that because I'm cheap and I didn't want to spend a whole lot of money on dirt, but it actually turns out that having a mix of garden soil and potting mix really is actually a good consistency for a raised bed. If you're concerned about weeds growing through the bottom of your garden beds, then you can always add weed barrier cloth to the bottom of it, and if you have a problem with gophers, then you can add something like hardware cloth or gopher mesh to them also. Then of course you can also plant directly into the soil. This is a good option if you want to have a very large garden, you have the space to pull that off, and you also have some pretty good soil. This is most commonly done in the form of a row garden where you have several of the same plant one after the other. Or you could go the route of having a food forest, and that method relies on using permaculture, where the plants that you put in your garden kind of complement each other, and it also has the added benefit of blending into the surroundings. It doesn't really look like a traditional garden, but if you live in a residential area, hiding vegetable plants among your other landscaping may be a good option. If you want to learn more about that, be sure to check out the book Secret Garden of Survival by Rick Austin. It's a very good resource for kind of understanding the basics of that concept. And if you're just interested in learning about permaculture, then Jaya's Garden would be a good book to pick up. Greenhouses are another option and can be built in a variety of sizes. Since they offer a more controlled environment than the outdoors, they can be used to grow plants throughout the year, and you may even be able to grow some tropical plants if you can keep it warm enough. Hydroponic and aquaponic gardens can be done in a greenhouse, a regular building, or even outdoors in the right environment. The main difference between the two is that hydroponic gardens just grow plants, while aquaponic gardens are used to raise fish at the same time. After you decide what kind of garden you're going to have, next you need to determine what you're going to grow. This includes the kinds of plants that you'll be growing, like tomatoes, peppers, and potatoes, along with whether you'll be growing heirloom varieties, hybrids, or a combination of the two. Heirloom varieties are the types of plants and seeds that are most often recommended by preppers. They're open pollinated, meaning that they rely on natural forces like insects or the wind for pollination. They grow true to type, meaning you can expect to grow the same kind of plant year after year, but one thing you have to be careful of is that you don't allow them to cross-pollinate, because then you could produce some hybrids maybe that you weren't expecting. But one way to reduce the chances of that happening is to just space your plants a little further apart. Hybrids are the most common kind of plant that you'll find at big box stores and hardware stores during the spring and summer. And while seeds from hybrids can be replanted, they may not be exactly what you're expecting. For example, the plants that they produce may have traits that's more like one parent plant than it is the other, and they may not be as fruitful as the plant that they came from. I did a full video explaining the differences between heirloom varieties and hybrids, and I'll link to that at the end of this video. Perennials grow back year after year, and they're often overlooked when it comes to preparedness gardening. Berry bushes are pretty easy to grow even with a small yard. You'll just need something like a trellis or some other support for them to grow on. And don't forget about fruit trees. Once they're established, they can produce a ton of food each season. But you want to be sure that you do your research and pick a tree that is well suited for your area. Also be sure to grow flowers and herbs. Herbs can be used for both food and medicine, and even inedible flowers can help attract pollinating insects such as bees to your garden. And that's very beneficial if you're growing heirloom varieties that are open pollinated. Another important consideration when starting your own garden is how are you going to start seeds? Starting seeds indoors is a good way to go ahead and get a head start, so that way you can start your seeds before the last frost and then just move them outside once it's warm enough. And another good thing about doing that is that you can start more seeds maybe than what you need, so that you can only choose the strongest plants to put in your garden. One common way to start seeds indoors is to use trays. These are a good option for starting a lot of seeds at once, which will be very useful if you're planning to have a large garden. When doing this, you're also going to probably need to purchase additional things like grow lights and heating pads. Then another good way to start seeds indoors is to use an arrow garden, and this is usually how I start my seeds. Arrow gardens are self-contained miniature hydroponic systems, and what I like about them is that they germinate seeds quickly and reliably. They also don't use a whole lot of energy. Mine uses around 21 watts with just the light on, and 23 watts total when the pump kicks on. And they're adjustable, so you can get the light the correct distance from your plants, and you can even get larger versions that can grow full-size tomato or pepper plants. While my arrow garden is designed to grow 6 plants, the seed starting kit will allow you to start up to 23 seedlings. To use it, start by replacing the original tray with the seed starting kit. Then soak the sponges in water. You can also soak them in the arrow garden itself, but this is a little faster. Next, place the sponges into the tray and drop your seeds down into the sponges. You can use tweezers to push the seeds down into the sponges if needed. I create a document to keep track of which variety is growing in each slot. After that, add some fertilizer and the arrow garden will do the rest. All you'll need to do is add additional water and fertilizer when the arrow garden tells you to, using the icons on the front of it. But when you start this many seedlings at once, you want to transplant them to a temporary container as quickly as possible, because if you don't, those water roots can get pretty long and they'll get tangled up in each other. And when transplanting seedlings, you can use a lot of different things. You can use plastic cups or the disposable plastic pots from previous year's plants. I used peat pots last year, but I probably won't do that again. I think going forward, I would rather have soil touching soil when I move my plants into their permanent home. But if you start your seeds indoors, you are going to need to harden them off gradually before you transplant them to their permanent home. And you want to start this process about a week or two before you do that final transplanting. So start by keeping them outside, maybe for like an hour in the shade. And then over the course of that time, each day, keep them out a little bit longer, also expose them to a little bit more sunlight. So that way, when you move them to their permanent home, they're less likely to be scorched by the sun. They're also less likely to die from some sort of shock. And that hardening process should be done whether you started your seeds in trays or in an aero garden. The next thing you need to think about is fertilization. I'll be using fish emulsion, which is nutrient rich and less likely to burn plants than manure. It's made from the remains of fish that have been processed for other things like fish oil. To use it, mix half an ounce of it with a gallon of water and then use that to water your plants. And how often you do it will depend on how nutrient dense your particular fish emulsion is. Cow manure can also be used as fertilizer, but it should be composted first, and you can compost other organic matter as well, including kitchen scraps. Then there's also some other equipment that'll make your life a whole lot easier. Watering cans are always good to have around, and when it comes to garden hoses, get one that's longer than what you think you'll need. You're probably going to end up needing to go around some obstacles, and having a little bit extra length will always ensure that you're able to get where you need to. Also, try to get one that's kink resistant. I have one by Flexzilla, and while it's okay, it isn't totally kink proof. A hose reel is another good thing to have since it'll keep hoses out of the way when not in use, and it makes getting them out and putting them back up a whole lot easier. Have a decent garden sprayer that you can use to water plants and clean stuff off. Try to get one with several spray patterns to suit as many tasks as you can. Having a couple of different shovels is also nice. Full-size ones work well if you're planting directly into the ground, while military-style shovels work well for moving soil into and out of containers. A trowel's handy if you're planting seedlings or moving soil into small pots. If you plan on starting seeds inside, you'll definitely need some decent grow lights and possibly some heating pads. Also, if you'll be growing larger plants, be sure to have a way to support them. I just use tomato cages for this, but don't wait too long to set them up. You don't want your plant being so large that when you place that tomato cage down on them that you break off branches. And if you wait too long, there could always be some sort of rainstorm that has heavy winds that could always just break the plants in half. Earlier I mentioned that I did a video covering the differences between heirloom seeds and hybrids. You can find that by clicking here. And if you want to see some foods that a lot of people forget to stockpile, check this video out. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.